Good afternoon and welcome to Role Models. My name is Britt Udison. I'm the Executive and Artistic Director of the Loft Literary Center, and I am really honored and a little bit nervous to be here. Not only am I here with two remarkable role models, but I'm here to close out Wordplay. It's been 5 weeks of truly remarkable literary programming that went from what we intended to be a live festival to virtual, and I've been humbled and honored to work alongside some of the most creative and hardworking people in the world. Thank you to the Loft staff. In the last few weeks, literally tens of thousands of people have shown up for each other and for books. And one thing, it was sad not to be in person, but if we were all together today in a tent in Minneapolis, we would be feeling snow. So sometimes the unexpected is a good thing. Thank you for showing up. None of it would have been possible without our visionary presenting sponsor, St. Catherine University and the Star Tribune. Thank you. Today's event is what we're calling a critical conversation. It's a partnership we do with St. Catherine's University where we specifically focus on issues of social justice and women in positions of leadership and critical conversations, which is one of the things we feel like books really do for us. They bring us together to talk about hard things and learn from each other. So thank you, St. Kate's, and thank you to our two guests. A role model is defined as a person whose behavior, example, or success can be emulated by others, especially by younger people. So I hope there's some younger people listening today. If not, this event will live forever at loft.org, and you can share it with the families and community members you have. We're here at the end of the Wordplay with two people equipped and ready to help us talk about dreaming big and leading into the future. Sylvia Acevedo is an award-winning entrepreneur who has earned worldwide recognition for her work in addressing one of society's most vexing challenges, universal access to education. She started her career as a rocket scientist at the Jet Propulsion Labs. Sylvia currently serves as commissioner on the White House Initiative for Educational Excellence for Hispanics and also serves as the CEO for the Girl Scouts of the United States. Wow. In her book, Paths to the Stars, My Journey from Girl Scouts to Rocket Science, you can learn more about Sylvia's inspiring journey. We're also joined today by Jennifer Steinhauer, who has covered numerous high-profile beats in her 25-year reporting career at the New York Times. From City Hall Bureau Chief and Los Angeles Bureau Chief to Capitol Hill, she won the Newswomen's Club of New York Front Page Deadline Reporting Award in 2006 for her reporting on Hurricane Katrina. She has written a novel about the television business. She's written 2 cookbooks, and today she's here to talk about her newest book, The Firsts, the inside story of the Women Reshaping Congress. We were to be joined today by Karine Jean-Pierre, but she's not able to be here, but we're still very, very lucky. Let me just say that that's the abridged version of these women's biographies. I would love to spend more time digging in, but with 2 people in a short period of time, we're not going to dig very deeply. What I want to encourage you to do is to buy their books. If you are streaming right now, you can see below you a link to buy from indie bookstores, both of their books, as well as support the Loft. Please consider doing that because part of what the Wordplay is about is supporting writers and their books and supporting indie bookstores. So, good afternoon, you two. Thank you so much for being here. We're meeting from all over the country, and I'm just honored and humbled and a little nervous to be talking with you. So thank you so much. I want to start with a question about your books. Both of you are extremely busy. Sylvia, you're hosting campouts in your backyard. You're leading national events and organizations. Jennifer, you're telling the stories of the world at a really strange and difficult time. And you have relationships and families and dinner to make. And you've decided to write a book. What was the thing that pushed you at this moment to write a book? And who did you have in mind when you were writing it? Sylvia, do you want to go first?
I'll go ahead and start. Hi. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all the people out there listening. I really appreciate it. And it's a real honor to be here. And Jennifer, it's amazing to be here alongside of you. I've read so much about you and read your articles as well. What prompted me to write a book is I gave a talk at a school, and after the talk, I walked outside the auditorium, and there was this really long line, and I said, "Oh, I guess that's the line for lunch." And no, that's the line of the kids that want to talk to you personally. Yeah. And I realized at that point that, I'm an engineer, scaling is important. I thought, today I can stay and talk to each one of them, but if they're representative of how many kids want to know this story, I've got to figure out another way. And so that was really what prompted me to write the book. The other thing was, and why did I write it for middle school? And the reason I wrote it for middle school is, when you've got those elevator doors closing and you put like a proverbial, maybe a hand or your purse right in the door so that they don't close shut. Middle school is that last time you can kind of get interested in math and science. And if you just have a modicum of interest and you learn algebra and other types of math and science, this whole world of opportunities is available to you because the whole world is being digitized. And even though, it's so important to get away from screens and all that, you have to have technology fluency at some level to really maximize your talents. And so what I wanted to do is all those kids who hadn't had that opportunity, I wanted to inspire them to really look at math and science one more time and to tell my story, which was a really unique story. I mean, there aren't a lot of people like me, and I came from a very humble background. And so helping them get inspired so that they can do it too is the reason I wrote the book.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Well, thank you again for being here. It's so great to be part of this festival and to be closing out this amazing, amazing event. I'm so humbled to be here and be here with someone who's got all the skills that I don't have. Every single one of them. Many things I did not acquire as a Girl Scout. So I would love to say I was laying in my bed and I had this amazing vision about women in Congress or some other romantic story, but it's actually a little more prosaic than that. I did get a call from an editor for the brilliant Betsy Leakett Algonquin, who shortly after the midterm elections in 2018, she was, as many people were, very mesmerized by this notion of all these women who had won enough seats to make this the largest number of women in Congress ever, even though pathetically it's not even a quarter of Congress yet, almost. But still, it was right at the 100th year anniversary of women's right to vote, you had the largest number. Enough of them ran and won that they changed power in the House, changed it from Republican to Democrat control, and that was done largely by women. And then third, of course, what I think intrigued her the most was the notion, as the book suggests, the title suggests, that so many of them were the first Muslim women to serve, the first Native American women to serve in the U.S. Congress. The youngest woman we all know, obviously, is AOC. We often forget that Donna Shalala, who was a cabinet secretary, is the oldest female to ever be a freshman in the House of Representatives. Someone in their 70s running around as a freshman in the House of Representatives. And a lot of women were first for their district. I often cite Lauren Underwood because she took a Republican seat in the suburbs of Chicago, the youngest, the first female, the first person of color to represent that district. So a lot of people were first to Congress, first for their district, bringing new faces and new sort of perspectives to the legislative body. And the question was, they had run unconventional campaigns, some of them, whether they unseated a Democrat who'd already been in office, a senior person, or they were in a Republican seat, they took a Republican seat. And what was going to happen? Would they take their unique qualities that helped them win in that very unusual and seismic midterm election, and would they take that to try and change Washington, or would Washington, as it most often does, change them? So that was sort of the question to explore the first year, and just to look at their journeys. Many of them, some of them had been in state legislatures or other leadership positions, but some of them were not and never had no political experience. And so it was to kind of look at what would these newcomers, how would they receive Washington, and how would Washington receive them?
That's great. Thank you both.
There's a really great intersection between Jennifer, your story, and what we're doing at the Girl Scouts as well right now. Yeah. 60% of the women in Congress are Girl Scouts. Yeah. And 3/4 of the female senators are Girl Scouts, and half of all female elected officials in America are Girl Scouts. And we're really proud. Lauren Underwood, she was Gold Award Girl Scout at AMC, Lifetime Girl Scout. And this summer, we're the only national youth nonprofit that focuses on civics. And we have civics curriculum from age 5 to 18. And in this year, we're producing democracy badges for girls age 5 to 18 because civics has been taken out of American classrooms in many, many states. And so we want to make sure that at Girl Scouts, you're going to learn about the 3 branches of government, and separations of power and other things that are so vital to keep democracy vibrant. And we want to have a lot more young women, women of all ages run for elected office and win.
Well, it's an interesting point too, because, people always ask me inevitably, how do you encourage women to run for office? And historically, this is changing, but historically women have not, they've had to be talked into running. Men look in a mirror and they say, I should be the next member of the House. I should be the next senator. Historically, women have not often done that. Even when women first got into Congress, the majority of them took the seats of their dead husbands. That was the majority of females in Congress, as few as they were in number for many years, and women had to be talked into running. So it is important for women to have platforms and kind of female spaces to gain leadership skills, I think, and to learn about civics and government and their role. So that is actually quite an interesting, and also, especially, I think, obviously you have partisan organizations that give money and lift women up in both parties, but it's also nice to have nonpartisan groups do that, because then you're really focusing on the leadership skills, the intellectual skills, the practical skills, and not so much, kind of having to dive into the partisan piece of it. Obviously, everyone will pick that later, but those things are just as important, right?
You're absolutely right. And one of the things that we discovered when we did a little bit more analysis on this, in the last election in 2018, the 2 youngest people elected at a state level and at a national level were women in New Hampshire. And she was a Girl Scout, and her project was ending child marriage in New Hampshire. And when she did that project and got that state law changed, she said, you know what, I can do it. Why am I not running? Why am I convincing these people? Why am I not one of those people? So as a teenager, she won her state seat. And then AOC, a lifetime Girl Scout, was also the youngest person, male or female, ever elected to Congress. And we see that intentionality when you're a 5-year-old or 6-year-old and you're earning your good neighbor badge by doing something in the civics environment. And a lot of times young girls, 5 and 6 years old, they go to the fire department to learn, and they'll ask, when they learn about the life resuscitation mask, they'll say to the fire department, what do you have for pets? Remember, a 5 and 6-year-old girl. And a lot of times the firefighters will say, we don't have anything. And of course the girls are horrified because they're thinking about their dogs or cats. And they'll say, why not? And they'll say, we don't have budget. And so the girls will use their cookie cash from selling the Girl Scout cookie money and buy, resuscitation masks for pets. And we have that story all over the country, from Oklahoma, from Washington State, California, etc. But then that girl sees that somebody wants their picture with them. And that girl's like, I just cared about the pet resuscitation mask. I don't know why you, mayor, chief of the fire department, want your picture with me, right? But then she remembers that. And when she's older, a brownie, she sees that park that's in disrepair. And she remembers that guy or that woman that wanted their picture with her. She calls them, they fix the park. And now she's like, I know how to do this. And what I'm proud of is every year for the last 3 years, we've had at least 3 state laws changed by girls in high school, just like Cassie in New Hampshire. And then the chance of them now running for Congress and representing us is much higher because they feel that. So that's why we're doubling our democracy badges, civics and democracy badges, because we want more girls to become those young women who lead us.
That's amazing. Thank you. One of the things that really stood out to me and is illustrated by what you were just talking about, Sylvia, is that in both of your books, you really highlight the fact that you don't have to be born into a fancy home or go to boarding school or be a man to be a phenomenal leader and to be someone who changes the world. So if it's not the perfect education or the fancy house, what are the trademarks or essential qualities that make someone a role model or a leader in the world? Being a Girl Scout sounds like a good start.
Well, yes, I would say that. And I have to say, my family, we really did live paycheck to paycheck, so much so that, we sometimes had to live with other family members. So, and I did live on a dirt street. So, it was that kind of beginning. but I was fortunate enough to have gotten into Girl Scouts, and my troop leader, she saw me looking at the stars one night, and she really saw that I had that interest in science. And so she really pushed me to earn my science badge. And by doing that, I realized I could do it. But the other thing was the cookie program. That I really do see as transformational. One, I grew up in a Spanish-speaking household. The culture, especially the Mexican culture, is a child doesn't speak first to the adults speak to the children. I wanted to do everything in Girl Scouts, so that meant, selling a lot of cookies. That's kind of hard to not speak to adults first to earn and get your cookie goals. And my troop leader taught me that you could make your life dreams, and you set a goal. And that's how you create opportunity. You set a goal, and then you break it down into achievable steps. And that was mind-blowing to me. Because suddenly I realized I could have my life dreams. And, when you live in poverty or near poverty, you don't know how to create opportunity. Because if you knew how to create opportunity, you wouldn't be in that situation. And so it taught me how to create opportunity. But the other thing was, and I think this has been really important to me about persistence and resilience, is she told me never to walk away from a cookie sale, until I'd heard no 3 times. That really mattered, because the first time somebody told me no, I stood there and she looked at me like I said no. And I looked at her thinking, there would have been a thought bubble on my head, and it would have said, Troop Leader Mrs. Provine said, you cannot leave the side of a sale until you hear no 3 times. So I asked her if there was anybody else at the house. No. The third time, it's like anybody else's day you would make. And she bought 1 box, probably to get rid of me, but it didn't matter. It taught me persistence and resilience. So as that elementary school girl, I realized, it's important to try to get to the yes, try to figure out how to get to the yes. So I began developing that muscle. So when I wanted to do things that were a little unusual, like play drums, when it's like, why are you not playing this other instrument? Why do you want to play the drums? Why do you want to carry the drums in marching band? Because I would figure out what it was that was the issue, and then I would solve for that. And then that allowed me to have this amazing career in Silicon Valley. Yes, I worked at JPL. And then, yes, I became a tech exec. One of the absolute few of my background to have ever become a tech exec in Silicon Valley, and unfortunately still true to this day. And that was because when I heard no, it was like, how do I get to that yes? And for a lot of women and a lot of girls, we're socialized to be nice. I said no to stop that. It's like, well, let's figure out, how do you get to that yes, and that persistence, that resilience, and then how do you create opportunities? Those things were really transformative for me, and I recognize them in other leaders as well.
Well, I built my entire career on people trying to get rid of me, because that's just journalism. So I identify with that, and I also was pretty good at selling cookies. But to speak to the women in my book, as you point out correctly, many of them not coming from political backgrounds, or as many of them said during their campaigns, not knowing each other at all, or even paying attention, maybe even having heard of each other at that point. There was an overlapping theme where they would say people like me are not supposed to be elected to Congress, people who had been at one point homeless, single mothers, people who'd been in domestic violence situations. So I would say 2 points to that. And this is something that's one part's changed over time and one hasn't. The first part that's changed, I think, in our politics, for better and worse, but definitely has benefited, I think, women a lot, is this kind of concept of authenticity and people wanting to be able to connect to people who lead them and not having to kind of put on a political face. I think a lot about Angie Craig from Minneapolis, actually, the Minneapolis suburbs, who ran the first time and lost. And she really studied other women and how they won when she came back in 2018 to win. And she kind of ditched her healthcare executive suit, and she felt comfortable putting on her jeans. She didn't hide from the fact that she was married to a woman, and they talked about their kids really openly and talked about, baseball games, and felt more comfortable being herself. And I think people make those connections with you when you're authentic and you have commitment. People don't like to think this about members of Congress, but I'm here to tell you that it's true. To a person, every one of them, very, very small minority not, no matter their party and their ideology, they enter public life, they enter Congress because they believe something and they want to make a difference. They may not always stay in that space, but that's how they start. And people can see that commitment when you're coming to their house at 2:00 in the afternoon in your snowshoes, trying to to connect with them. Now, the one thing that's a little different than what you were describing in terms of your own sort of self-motivations, although role models are important as well, is that politics is about coalitions and bringing people along. And the authenticity that I talked about and the commitment I talked about are there. You have to really, to be able to do that and to have a message that, and a commitment to that message that's really usually appealing across a lot of lines. You know, a lot of people tend to think, especially about many of the women that I wrote about, that they're winning on changing demographics and that there are more minorities in their community, so therefore they were able to get that vote. Well, first of all, that wasn't even mathematically true in many cases. AOC, for example, actually won greatly with white people who were gentrifying a certain section of Queens, who'd moved out of Manhattan and really were kind of in that, you know, the Bernie camp and really believed in the stuff that she was talking about. Ayanna Pressley in Boston had a broad, multi-racial, multi-ethnic coalition because she understood how to communicate this concept of a need for change in leadership and a need for change in the type of people who represented Congress. So I think being able to communicate that and build coalitions and learning how to get people to come with you, that is a key thing.
Thank you both. I'm trying, my brain is going so fast. I have all sorts of follow-up questions. I want to encourage our audience, if you have questions as we're talking, please ask them. I could keep going, but this is supposed to be participatory, so please start asking questions. We're talking about role models. That's the point here. And I'm curious if you can talk about either people you have met along the way of writing this book or as you have been growing up in the world. Who were your role models and how have you implemented what you learned from them into what you're doing now or into this book?
Well, I'll start. You know, when the other reason I wrote a book for middle school is exactly your question. I grew up in southern New Mexico, which was a really small town at that time. And, you know, my role models were from books that I read. So it was Clara Barton, it was Florence Nightingale. And people thought because I read so much about Clara Barton and Florence Nightingale that I wanted to be a nurse. That wasn't it. The essence of them was, you know, Clara Barton, she was an inventor. She created the first aid kit. She started the American Red Cross. She's the one that figured out the hub-spoke system to get supplies more readily to the front lines, and that whole warehouse system that the U.S. Army copied her methodology. So I think it was the systems thinker in her, but of course she's remembered as the angel of the battlefield. Florence Nightingale, I mean, what I loved about her is, you know, she created the modern triage method that was still being used to this day in healthcare. But she did it by analyzing how to better treat people on the, wounded people in the Boer War. And what she realized is with her system of triage, which was against what they were doing at the time, they would save many lives. No one believed her because what was she? She was a nurse, right? So she did the math, she did the statistics and showed the statistics, and people didn't believe her. So she did something that was so innovative. She hired a map maker, a cartographer, to visually depict her data. And that's why if you use Excel, why are they called charts? They're called charts because that's what map makers made. They made charts. So she's the one that figured out, how do I visually represent this information? And she created a graph. And with that graph, it became incredibly obvious to anyone that the deaths rate would completely decline if you used her method, right? It's still kind of called one of the 3 charts that changed the world, right? So I love that. And then she became the first woman allowed into the Royal Statistical Society. But history does not remember her that way. They remember her, right, the bedside nurse, right? But actually, I read so much about her that I pieced together wow, she's changed the world, and she did it by math. So those were inspiring role models for me.
Great.
So I would say a few things. First of all, growing up and really wanting to be a journalist at a young age, it was like Woodward and Bernstein. There were all these male journalists. Men were depicted as journalists on television. You didn't, even though as I got older, would read about pioneers and women in the New York Times newsroom who, had sued for equity and so forth. Brenda Starr was actually literally my role model. I would read this cartoon and think, she's so cool, And it's kind of funny to reflect upon. I haven't, until you asked that question, having to actually go to fictional role models for a profession because you didn't necessarily see them elevated at that time. My story, when I got to the New York Times as a very young news clerk, is almost the opposite of yours, because my role model was this extremely wealthy woman named Geraldine Fabricant. And the reason that she inspired me so much is this is a woman who had someone come to her house every day on Fifth Avenue and set her hair. She had a lot of money. She had no need to work in journalism, even at the highest level, is still, not considered a wealth-gaining profession. And she was one of the most competitive journalists I'd ever known. And this is long before, internet. She covered business, and she found out there was a deal going down. And this was very typical. And I would sit and listen to her on the phone because she knew she was well-traveled. And she was, knew this whole world of privilege. She wanted to find the leader of the company that was doing the merger. And she called his office and they said, "I'm sorry, he's in Paris." And she went through and she found the phone numbers. And she knew which all the highest end hotels were in Paris. And she called each one until she tracked him down. That was the kind of way she used her privilege and her knowledge to really infiltrate the world of big business. And I would listen to her on the phone and she would say, I would listen to her type, okay, interesting. Well, listen, the first thing I want to say is everything you've just said to me is a lie, and I don't believe one word of it. And she would just confront these titans of industry, this woman in her elegant haircut, and I just wanted to be Jerry Fabricant. I mean, she was just really something else. And I was lucky to have that to look to, women in a male-dominated profession who really, you had to be pretty tough, which is true in most male-dominated professions. And it wasn't at that time really about crying sexism. That didn't get you anywhere, So you really had to have thick skin and be tough and be able, and that was a very good skill to have in journalism, where you're confronting institutions and people in government and being able to do that. So, and then finally, in terms of the book, when I first started doing the research, of course, I was immediately in love with Jeanette Rankin, the first female member of Congress. The fact that she was running for office before women had the federal right to vote. They did in her state of Montana, but they didn't have the right to vote. And she was running as a suffragist. I mean, can you imagine what that was like? And, that not necessarily a popular national platform, but because she advocated for farmers and labor's rights and children's rights, and had a lot to in common with some of the women who ran in 2018. I was just fascinated with her, and I loved that when she showed up to Congress, of course, people couldn't wait to see her and who was this woman. And they also, as you mentioned, I've written cookbooks, so I'm a love to bake, and everyone wanted to know about Jeanette Rankin's lemon pie. I've tried a lot to make her pie. So I love that she made this pie, and she was this pioneer and stuck to her principles. She's the only person, I think, ever in the history to vote against World War I and World War II, which was in service to her pacifist agenda. So she's a great woman to learn more about.
I was so grateful for your book. There were a lot of women where I kind of thought I knew stuff, but you brought a lot of them into the spotlight. So thank you for that. You also bring up one of the questions I've been wanting to ask you. Even in 2020, I imagine that in your roles, you are still sometimes the only woman at the head of the table. And I'm curious about if you've ever been questioned in that position, or if your expertise has been, Sylvia's laughing, if your expertise has ever been challenged there. And I would love for some of, I was going to say younger, but heck, any of us, if you have advice of what works well in that position or what doesn't work well, and ways in which we can respond to when our position of leadership or expertise is challenged.
Well, great. Thanks for that question. Just recently, I was talking about the book, Path Through the Stars, to a bunch of young girls. And one girl said, I want to be an engineer. So what do I need to do? And to be successful, I said, of course, you have to know math and science. And the other part is the absolute confidence you have to have. Before you can convince anybody else, you have to convince yourself. And I'll tell you from my experience, your math always gets checked. When I worked at JPL, they were always checking my math. And as a rocket scientist, you're like, hey, I got this. right? And so there is that confidence that you have to have in that belief in yourself. That is really key. The other thing that you realize is being the only person in the room, sometimes you've got to be very clear when you're making your points, because if you're talking, you make a point 3 times, people are like, oh my gosh, you're talking so much, right? So you've got to be very, very strategic in that. And the other thing is, try to build allies. If there are no other women in the room, try to have another ally. When I was on the White House Commission during the Obama administration, in the educational group, what I noticed is the women were being kind of talked over. And so we got a group where we would amplify one another. So when somebody said something and somebody else would make the same point, we would then say, John, that was a great point. But when Becky made it, I think it was a little bit more insightful, but you have to do that. You have to help one another out. And then also, if you're the only one and somebody, takes credit for your work or whatever, you're like, I'm not sure how that added on to the point I had previously made. So can you help me understand what that point was, how that was adding to my point? You've got to have that kind of confidence. Otherwise, people leave the room thinking this other individual did that. So, it sometimes can be incredibly competitive, a little bit of sharp elbows, but own yourself, own your confidence. You've got that.
So I'm not in rooms where I'm the only woman as a journalist most of the time. Our profession is pretty 50-50 these days. Happily. I do very much identify with the meeting thing. And we have a very large meeting in our office where many people sit around a table, and it's so big we have to sit around in a ring in chairs. And I noticed once that the women were all sitting in the chairs on the side of the room. And I tried to get women to go, like one day, let's all sit at the table, and people walk in and it's surprised, not because there's women, but people they aren't used to seeing sitting there. And I think women have to, when you're not the only woman, have to be each other's allies and make sure that that whole meeting interruption thing and taking credit for things, that they back each other up. But I would say something in reverse of that, which I think a lot about a story about Homer Biggert, who was a very famous New York Times a reporter who would go, he went at one point to a small town and was asking questions. I think it was about a local crime story. And then he was followed up by another reporter. And he said, oh gosh, that guy Homer Biggert came here before you, and he was so dumb, I just had to tell him everything. And of course, he got the big story because he took advantage of the fact that the person he was interviewing thought he didn't know anything and thought he was very ignorant. So I think of that story in this context of people are sometimes not responding to you the way they would a man, and you think, because of some sort of internalized or very overt sexism. I think you can actually turn that to your advantage. Now, when you have the power of the pen, sometimes that's a little more helpful. But I actually think that you can get in situations where their underestimation of you can backfire for them at a time of your choosing.
I like that. Thank you. So one thing, I loved reading your books because they were both inspiring and challenging, and Karine's book as well. And I learned a lot, but I also loved specifically at this moment reading it because it is such a scary and stressful and unclear time. And I felt like you both offered inspiration on how to be a leader and to be civically engaged at this moment. And I'm curious, this is kind of a big question. If in this moment you have a hope for what we will as a community learn from this time, or what steps we as community members can take to learn and make positive change because of it. So cure the pandemic. That's my simple question for you too.
Cure the pandemic. What we did as Girl Scouts is, I just didn't want to press pause. And I think having run international global business units, et cetera, I realized the importance of acting quickly. So very rapidly, keep girls safe. We immediately stopped all in person, but we created a national cookie care program so you could still get your cookies even though the season was abrogated. But the other thing is, within 9 days, we put all of our programming virtual so that girls could still be enjoying that great skill building, but more importantly, engaging with one another in a way that's not school, kind of like reaching through that computer screen and holding another girl's hand. That sisterhood, that community is so important. But also what you can still do to take action from where you are. And what I love is we created a couple national service projects so that girls stop just thinking about how this pandemic affected them, but they thought about others and how you can change the world. So girls began letter writing campaigns, and one of our national service projects was to have girls write letters to those who were in senior centers or in nursing homes, and they had been closed off and no longer could get the hug from their families or from anyone, right? But they got cards, letters, posters from those from girls telling them how important they were and somebody cared about them. Also, we launched the cookie care program so that first responders, truck drivers who were providing supplies across the country, whether you were stopping in New Mexico or Ohio, at those truck stops, that iconic cookie, which is emblematic of hope, and people are saying, this American institution, this icon, you're getting it because somebody believes in you and is grateful for what you're doing for us. You're putting your life on the line. And obviously to all the first responder healthcare workers, I saw so many stories of healthcare workers who, like, at the end of their shift, they were so tired. So, but when they got the cookies, they're like, somebody cares, somebody noticed, somebody is grateful to me and appreciative. And then tens of thousands of homemade face masks. So we didn't want girls to feel hopeless. We wanted girls to kind of turn that energy and still be earning their badges. We've had virtual campouts. Girls are still earning their space science badges, their robotics badges, making friendship bracelets. We're still doing singing, make new friends, and, friendships circles. It's so important. You still have to feel that camaraderie, still have to feel that fun. It's not school, but also giving you those skills that make you realize that you can make a difference in the world.
I think kind of picking up on that, especially the virtual element, and not pausing. One thing that has been disappointing, obviously, and upsetting and a little frightening about this period is understanding very acutely that this is a situation where government has not always been successful in stepping up, and sometimes we've seen the private sector step up. Sometimes they're just crippled by the rapidity of the disease, and so community is very important. I mean, here I'm in the District of Columbia. We have, I think, the biggest disparity, racial and class disparity in COVID cases and certainly deaths. And our social service organizations are completely overwhelmed. And I have been amazed at people who started something as small as an email chain that became now a full-fledged, looks like a nonprofit website they've started just in these weeks. And they have volunteers fanning out through the city, packing boxes of food, delivering food, getting groceries for people who can't do it, making the masks, as you point out, and delivering things, donating money. It's not a blip. It's a constant. It's a part-time job for most people who live here at this point. And being able to connect with people, whether it's around those issues or just something fun like doing a book event, and I've done several of them. What's nice about it is when you go to a city like Minneapolis or Austin or Boston, you do an event, everyone who lives there shows up to the store and has your event with you. And it's one upside I think has been nice is to be able to connect with people across the country at an event they would otherwise obviously not be at or have access to, because you're convening around an interest in a subject, not just because you happen to live someplace and this thing is there that you can do. And I think that creates its own communities of interest that I hope will continue and be spaces where people can also start to pick up notions and ideas about leadership.
Those are great. Thank you. I think I'll add a little bit, Jennifer, to what you said, in that when we had to go virtual for this, there was a great sense of loss. And yet the one thing that's been surprising and wonderful about it is we've reached people in Ireland and Iceland and Alaska and places that wouldn't be able to show up on a potentially really cold Saturday afternoon to be with us. So it's been a really wonderful thing. The last question I have for you before we open it up to the audience is, I'll start with you, Jennifer. What in the process of writing this book surprised you? I mean, you're a veteran journalist who has covered this beat for a while. So Ed, when you dug in at the book length, what surprised you about either the people you were covering or the process?
The people, I would just say there were people that I didn't necessarily think were going to be interesting that ended up being really interesting. People who I thought would have these great stories who kind of fade into the background. That kind of always happens in Congress. I think for process, it's not that interesting, but it was my cross to bear, which is that writing, I thought, oh, I am a reporter. I write, nonfiction every day. I got this, and I didn't. Writing a book length of narrative nonfiction is hard, and I have a distinct memory of sitting in Phil's coffee on a July day. It was about 100 degrees, and there was no air conditioning. And I just sat there, and I said, I'm not getting up from my seat until I get this more organized. And for 8 hours, I sat, and there were guys with their headphones on next to me, and they got 97 different coffees, and people came and went, and I just stayed in that seat. Then it was humbling, something I'd done for so long that books are hard. I shouldn't be weak of heart if you're going to enter that space.
Thank you. Sylvia?
The thing that surprised me is, when I went back and thought about my life, because it's my life until my early 20s, and this thing came when your synapses got rewired, and suddenly you're back there. And that happened so many times, in that, I could feel exactly how that young Sylvia felt. The emotional moment for me in the book that still is really tough is when my sister got sick with meningitis, and my mother didn't drive a car. We didn't have a telephone. So my sister was lifeless in my mom's arms and running down the street, banging on doors of our neighbors, begging people for help. I remember that fear, that scare, that girl, and how that felt. And I was transported. And then at other times in the book, I remembered these things, and I was like, oh my gosh, when I was trying to get stronger so I could play the large timbales in the marching band, because my band director told me I couldn't play them. And I said, that was my first no. And I said, why not? And he said, well, you're a girl. And I'm like, that's not going to change. Why not? And he goes, because you're not strong enough. And so, okay, I'm going to work on that. And I began working out in a really unusual way. I went and got rocks and would carry rocks on a football field. And I would ride a bike over there. And that was sort of my makeshift way. And I remembered that. And I asked my older brother, and he said, oh gosh, he goes, you were such a dork. But you
brothers,
things, and these things come back, and you really are kind of reliving that emotion. And I wanted to make sure in Paths to the Stars that because it was for middle school, that I had that emotional angst. So that was a really challenging part for me, was just making sure you captured the vulnerability, the emotions, the conflicts that you had. And the other part that the sharp editors at HMH saw in Paths to the Stars is, I had a very challenging relationship with my father. My father was very traditional, didn't have the same vision for me as I had for myself. And we had a very challenging relationship. And in my initial writing of the book, I left that out. And the editors at HMH and Ann Hopp was like, no, there's something missing here. So we put that in, and it is really been wonderful, because at the end you get a good feeling of how my father and I ended up, but we had some very, very challenging moments, and not unlike a lot of kids' experiences with their parents. And I've had many kids come up to me and say that I gave them hope. And I remember speaking at a foster center, a center for foster youth, and this girl said, I had an abusive father as well. That's why I'm in the foster system. And she said, but if you can overcome that, you give me hope. And so I was so grateful that I included that part in Path to the Stars, even though it made me very uncomfortable. But I realized it was accurate, authentic, and it's given hope to other children.
And as an adult, I'll say, I know it was targeted at middle school kids, but as an adult reading it, I felt taken along with that emotional journey as well, and was scared for your sister and for your family. And it was a beautiful book. Thank you. And Jennifer, thank you for bringing these people who we can easily see as sort of two-dimensional caricatures right now in this political climate, and to really whole people and talk about the ways that they've changed Congress and changed this country. I loved both of your books, so thank you. I'm going to invite Caitlin to come in now. We have a lot of questions from our audience. So Caitlin, please join us.
Yeah, so we do have a lot of questions, and the one that everyone is upvoting and making sure that we call attention to is from 10-year-old Riley from Idaho. The question is, how do you think I could get started in politics? What do you think is a good young role model?
Jennifer, you want to start and I'll add?
Well, I think that, when people ask me how they can become journalists, I always say start writing as soon as you can for anything you can, a school paper, write. So I would say anything that's equivalent in politics that you have in your school, if you can run for student government, if there's any leadership role at all that you can take on, even just running a committee in a class, or volunteering to organize, how do we take care of the school pet when, the hamster when we're out of school? Just try to always be the person who leads, the person who says, I'll take care of that. I'll organize that. I got that. That's a really good way at a young age to show the leadership and to learn the interpersonal political skills that you'll need to succeed to run for office.
Yeah, one of the things that we call it take action projects, or our bronze, silver, and gold awards at Girl Scouts, is we really ask them to identify a challenge or an issue in their community and work to solve it. And when you do that, whether it's like you need a crosswalk, you need a sidewalk, you need a traffic light, you need a park replenished, whatever need you see, and it is really can be just starting with the helping of firefighters get the funding to get pest resuscitation. You realize that you're part of this system and that your voice matters, and you can bring people to help solve it. And an advantage you have as a youth is that when you're coming together and you're saying, I don't feel safe at this crosswalk or at this intersection, and it needs either a stop sign or a traffic light, your voice truly matters, because people will say, this kid, they're really doing something, they're showing leadership, and they get very inspired by that. So I would recommend start looking at projects in your community. Whether I think about this young Girl Scout in California. She lived in Santa Cruz and saw so many sea animals that were harmed because of the plastic and plastic bags and straws. So she started a campaign on that. It was her project and Gold Award project in Girl Scouts. It became No Straw November throughout California. Alaska Airlines took out plastic straws. Then Starbucks took out plastic straws. So, she started by this one thing. I don't want to have plastic straws, in our bay. And it became something bigger.
That's awesome. Great answers. Thank you. Okay. Our next question is from social media. What are you working on now during this time, and how has it shifted with the pandemic?
Well, I have I'm the CEO of Girl Scouts, so I'm running it out of my home office here. I do virtual all the time. In fact, I feel like I'm working more than I was when I was traveling 2/3 of the time. But I really love the virtual experience. I do miss the camaraderie and the in-person relationship, but there is ability to reach so many people virtually. So that's what I'm doing right now.
I agree that you kind of work more from home sometimes. I just have changed my focus, obviously, in my journalism beat to write more broadly about different themes that I see in our community that have been affected by the crisis. And I think, too, it's weird. You manage your schedule differently when you're working from home. It's not, here's my time to breakfast, then here's my time for my commute, and then here's my time, commuting home and make dinner. Things are kind of happening. You have to grocery shop at certain times of day, safety in mind, so your day is sort of reordered in this weird way. And I think, I always try to take some time out to do some things around the book and do some things to volunteer that you couldn't normally do in the middle of the day because you'd be at work. So I think that the whole work day has just been completely reordered in this very strange way.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Okay, let's see. There's so many questions. How do I pick? Let's go with another one from social media. This question is for Jennifer. What was the craziest fun fact you learned while researching Congress?
Oh, wow. I mean, some of the things about the women were so interesting. I mean, knowing that Sharice Davids, of all the things she'd accomplished, she was a martial arts expert, and, learning about all of her martial arts things, which came to help her a lot when she'd visit middle schools, because she could always do more push-ups than anybody, including the principal. But the women in history are so interesting because they're such, products of the time that they were in, whether it was in the suffragist movement or prohibition and so forth. And one woman ran basically just to try and to get into Congress to finagle to get her husband out of jail, who'd been in jail on prohibition charges. So people are motivated for all these bizarre things, and they kind of get lost to history. And then you read these crazy little stories about all these very feisty women who may have only served one term or kind of been lost to the history books, but there are so many of them. I would actually tell people, if you're really interested in quirky stuff about Congress, that you go to the House Historian's website. There's all these oral histories there. You have to kind of dig around in there, but you'll find a lot of really kooky stuff about how women stood outside the men's gym in workout clothes. And then gym master said, "What are you doing here? You can't work out here. It's the men's locker room," but they were trying to demonstrate that they needed their own gym. So that's what's like this was going on in the middle of the congressional day.
Wow. Very cool. All right. So this question is from Steph. Jennifer, you write about the squad, and Sylvia, Girl Scouts is divided into troops of people. There seems to be something really powerful about women in groups. Why do you think that is?
Oh, gosh. I have to say that we've really discovered that even more so virtually. The girls really do get a lot of camaraderie from each other, the friendship circles. We know that when we develop our programs, girls care about one another, and we build that in. We've done a great job with our science, technology, engineering, and math. We have cybersecurity programs. Girls are taking them and earning, like last year, 1 million science, technology, engineering, math badges. But what we did that was different is we built a lot of the curriculum about how girls interact with one another. And that's not typically how science or STEM or engineering is taught. And so we realized that there is just this unique aspect that a lot of girls just enjoy, the friendship and the fun and the engagement with one another.
Yeah, I would answer that almost a little more generically, although I've seen it across different groups in Congress, different groups of women and different groups across my life. I once heard someone say something that really stuck with me, which is that women will tell each other, two female strangers, will tell each other more about their lives meeting for 2 hours on an airplane trip than most men will tell their best friends over a lifetime. I think that has a lot to do with how women, not all women obviously, but women generally tend to communicate a little differently, and they tend to enjoy and thrive on intimacy personally, and even in a professional way. And I think that it's nutrition, if you will. It makes people feel good. It makes people, even if they hate their workplace, they're like looking for these other women to kind of get them through the day. If they love their workplace, they're kind of sharing that experience together. I think it's that emotional bond that that women find with each other that's just a little different. It's not that they don't have that with men or their families, but it's just that's a unique thing. I started a group recently for Generation X women because I thought we were kind of like, this lost group. And I thought, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 people will show up. And like 30 people showed up because they were eager to speak to other women, in this case, particularly of their own generation. So I think women just naturally gravitate to each other's company.
Great. Okay, let's see. This question is, I lost the question. Where did it go? Okay, this question is from Sheila. She says, I'm glad to hear journalism is currently 50-50 both genders. Do you foresee future changes in assertive or intellectual men being seen as successful compared to assertive or intellectual women? How do you see the future of women in politics?
Well, I'm glad for that question, because one thing that came out of Elizabeth Warren losing in the Democratic primary is this conclusion that women can't win higher office. And that's obviously because of this incredibly frustrating reality that we're one of, a country, unlike many other countries, that have not been able to elect women to the highest office. However, primaries being the biggest hurdle for women, once they get through them, they win general elections at the same rate as men. So I think that the future for politics for women is strong, and I think that is evidence that it's impactful when you get women in large quantities. I always talk about the Nevada legislature, which is just slightly majority female now, and they passed all kinds of laws in a bipartisan manner. For example, mandating funding for rape kits and all kinds of things right out of the box. So I really do actually think the future for women in politics is bright, and I wouldn't dismiss sexism as an element of Elizabeth Warren's loss in any way, but I also would not take that as a sign that women can't win.
Great. Sylvia, did you want to add anything? Or,
I think as you're younger, really develop that confidence in yourself. That's so important, that you can win. I think earlier Jennifer said a lot of women don't see themselves in that, and it's so important to believe that you do, that you can win, and then build your posse, your troop, your squad, to help get those things that you care about to make them into law.
Great. I think that's a really lovely note for us to end on, and we're really grateful to have this squad with us right now. Before I turn it back to Britt, I'm just going to mention one more time here at Wordplay, as the giving director at the Loft, that we would love to have your support as audience members. If you've enjoyed any moment of Wordplay, I've seen so many comments in this conversation in the chat bar about how amazing this has been. Please consider making a contribution so that the Loft can continue to bring awesome programming like this to your homes. We had a fantastic match yesterday that we kicked butt at and raised over $1,100 that turned into $2,100 thanks to our match. So thanks to everybody. And Britt, why don't you close us out?
Thanks, Caitlin. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Jennifer. It's really, I am not being hyperbolic in saying that it's really an honor to be on screen with both of you. And you've really helped at a moment of darkness to talk about how to dispel hopelessness, how to have confidence in yourself, and in the power of a squad. So thank you both. It's a bittersweet moment right now because this is the end of virtual Wordplay, and it's been a grueling 5 weeks for many of us on staff. And I want to thank my colleagues for their creativity, for their thoughtfulness, and for their commitment to the virtual community, to the literary community, which has become virtual in the last few months. Thank you to our visionary sponsor, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune. Thank you to the literally tens of thousands of humans who've shown up. I think, one of the things that gets me out of bed every morning is the idea that literature is the center of civic life. It's how we understand each other, is through listening to stories, both in novels and in the New York Times and in memoirs. It's how we understand each other, how we make sense of the world. And in this time, that has been proven to be true for a lot of us. So thank you for making Wordplay possible. I feel deeply, deeply grateful to have been a part of this and to have assertion and support in the idea that stories bring us together and bring us light. Wordplay ends in the next few seconds, but the Loft is still here. And I encourage you to visit loft.org. Every single one of these events will live forever. If you missed this or you want to share it with your family, come back to loft.org. And it continues with more programming. We have classes and events throughout the summer that are virtual. We have scholarships and opportunities for people to participate at every level. So thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, The Loft. And thank you, authors and readers.